Hello, welcome to our daily read aloud. Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. Yesterday we stopped reading in the middle of a chapter, and Nicodemus was going with his friend Jenner to explore and look for a new place to set up their life. We know at this point from all of his stories that they do like living at the farm in the Rosebush with their cave, but they've decided they don't want to steal for a living anymore. They don't want to steal food or electricity or water or anything. So they are trying to find their own area where they can go live and be undisturbed and live a life that's not full of theft, right? They don't want to have that as part of what they do anymore. So we know that he and Jenner are walking. They're trying to figure out a good spot. They're asking squirrels and chipmunks and all these animals about where they could set up. And they said, you need to go ask the owl. And that is where we stopped. So they advised me to ask the birds, more specifically one bird, a very old owl who was famous throughout the forest. They even told me how to find the enormous tree in which he lived. That was the beginning of my acquaintance with the owl. He knew every tree, every trail, every stone in the forest. He was, as you know, not naturally friendly towards rats, or mice either. But when I told him about our life at NIMH and our escape, he grew interested. Though he did not say so, I think he had already been watching some of our activities from the air in the evenings. Anyway, he was curious and listened carefully when I told him about our problems and my ideas for solving them. I have talked to him many times since. It was he who told me about Thorn Valley. The valley lies deep in the forest, beyond the big tree. The jeep trails do not cross it, nor even go close to it, for the mountains around it are forbidding, too steep and rocky even for jeeps, and are covered with thorny thickets. The owl told me that in all the years he had been flying, he had never seen a human being near it. Yet the bottom of the valley is level and broad and nearly a mile long. Steep cliffs wall it in all around. There are 3 ponds or small lakes in it, and apparently these are fed by springs, for they never dry up. On clear days, the owl said, he sometimes saw fish swimming in them. I thought, could rats weave fish nets or make fish hooks? It was this valley I was looking for the day I set out with Jenner. I had careful directions from the owl, yet it took us half a day, moving briskly, to reach the base of the mountains. Then up, very steeply for more than an hour. Not really difficult for us, since rats are better climbers than men. Also, we are shorter. So we had little trouble with the spiny underbrush. From the top of the high ridge at last, we looked down at the valley that lay before us. It was beautiful and still, a wild and lonely place. Through the green and yellow treetops below us, I could see the water of one of the ponds sparkling in the sun. I got the idea that my eyes, our eyes, were the first ever to see it. Yet that was not true. For as we descended into the valley, a deer suddenly appeared in the trees ahead and went bounding off down the slope. There were wild animals there, and I wondered if they even suspected that outside these walls of mountains were cities and roads and people. Most of the valley floor was in forest, great spreading oaks and maple trees, but near one of the ponds I saw what I had hoped to find, a large natural clearing. A glade where only coarse grass and wildflowers grew, and some clumps of black raspberry bushes. This clearing was on the far side of the valley. Beyond it, the mountain wall rose again, a steep slope with big outcroppings of stone, granite ledges that thrust 6 or 10 feet out of the earth. We could live here, I said to Jenner. I suppose we could, he said. It's a beautiful place, but it's a long way from the barn. Think how far we'd have to carry food, and no electricity. We could grow our own food, I said. I started to add, but didn't. And maybe someday make our own electricity, if we decided we wanted to. We don't know how. Anyway, where could we grow it? Right here. It would be easy to clear away these weeds and bushes, and if we dug into that mountainside under those rock ledges, we'd have all the cave space we wanted, dry and warm, with a good roof. There could be room enough for 1,000 of us. There aren't 1,000 of us. There might be someday. But why? Why move? We've got a better place to live right now. We've got all the food we want. We've got electricity and lights and running water. I can't understand why everybody talks about changing things. Because everything we have is stolen. That's silly. Is it stealing when farmers take the milk from cows or eggs from chickens? They're just smarter than the cows and chickens, that's all. Well, people are our cows. If we're smart enough, why shouldn't we get food from them? It's not the same. Farmers feed the cows and chickens and take care of them. We don't do anything for what we take. Besides, if we keep it up, we're sure to be found out. What then? What if we are? People have been trying to exterminate rats for centuries, but they haven't succeeded. And we're smarter than the others. What are they going to do? Dynamite us? Let them try. We'll find out where they keep the dynamite and use it on them. Then we'd really be found out. Don't you see, Jenner? If we ever did anything like that, they'd figure out who we are and what we know. Then only two things could happen. Either they'd hunt us all down and kill us, or they'd capture us and put us in a sideshow, or maybe take us back to NIMH. And this time we'd never get away. I don't believe any of that, Jenner said. You've got this idea stuck in your head. We've got to start from nothing and work hard and build a rat civilization. I say, why start from nothing if you can start with everything? We've already got a civilization. No, we haven't. We're just living on the edge of somebody else's, like fleas on a dog's back. If the dog drowns, the fleas drown too. That was the beginning of an argument that never had a satisfactory ending. Jenner would not yield to my point of view, nor I to his. It wasn't that he was lazy and didn't want to work. He was just more cynical than the rest of us. Stealing did not bother him. And he was a pessimist. A pessimist, that means you see the bad in things. If you're an optimist, you typically see the good in things. He never believed that we could really make it on our own. Maybe he was right. But I, and most of the others, felt that we must at least try. If we fail, well, then I suppose we must come back here or find some other farm. Or eventually forget all we learned and go back to stealing garbage. So we began working out the plan. It has been a long time coming. 3 years ago this spring we started watching Mr. Fitzgibbon to learn what he did and how we did it, to bring food out of the earth. We collected books and magazines on farming. We discovered early that in order to stop stealing, we would for a while have to steal more than ever. We've laid up a 2-year food supply so that even if we don't succeed in growing a good crop the first year, we won't go hungry. We've got 2/3 of it moved to Thorn Valley already, and we've dug a dry cave to store it in, under one of those big rocks. We've got seeds, we have our plows, we've cleared and cultivated part of the land near the pond, and in a few days we'll begin our first planting. We've even dug some irrigation ditches in case there's a drought, so that would be a way to water their crops. We have a schedule worked out, sort of a countdown, and by early June, we will be out of this cave and out of Mr. Fitzgibbon's barn, I hope, forever. All right, our next chapter is called Captured. I'm going to get a quick drink. So before I read on, we obviously can't really have a discussion, but I want you to think. If you were in class, I would ask you to make a prediction about if you think the rats will succeed when they go to Thorn Valley, or if they're going to have to go back and resort to a life of stealing. So think about, why do you think they might succeed or fail? Think about that for a minute. And if you're done thinking on that, think about who you agree with more, Jenner or Nicodemus. I can see both parts of their arguments. I understand Jenner doesn't want to go back to a harder life with no luxury. I understand that. But I also understand Nicodemus's point of view. I don't think I would be very happy in my life if everything I did was stealing. So I think I kind of side with Nicodemus. All right, captured. Speaking of schedules and countdowns, Mr. Aegis spoke suddenly. We've got one for this evening. It's getting late. The clock on Nicodemus's desk said 5 o'clock. Mrs. Fitzgibbon feeds Dragon at 6 p.m. He spoke gently, but his voice had a chilling sound to Mrs. Frisby. They all looked at her. "I'm ready," she said quietly, "but there are still a few minutes, and one question you have not yet answered. Why did Jonathan never tell me anything about NIM or any of the rest?" Mr. Aegis said, "I'll try to explain. When Nicodemus and the others moved into the cave near the rose bush, they invited Jonathan and me to stay with them. After all, we had been with them for many months by that time, and at first we did. But after a few weeks, we decided to move out. We were, you realize, different. We both felt strange, associating always and only with rats, even though they were our close and good friends. As for me, I wanted more solitude and less society. Jonathan, on the other hand, was younger than I and felt lonely. So we moved, at first together to the basement of the old farmhouse where I still live. Then Jonathan met you at a stream near the woods somewhere, I think he said. Yes, Mrs. Frisby said. I remember. From then on, he worried. He didn't want to be secretive, but he didn't know how to tell you one thing. I'm sure Nicodemus has explained to you that the injections we got at NIM had two effects. One of them was that none of us seemed to be growing any older at all. The children, yes, but not the adults. Apparently, the injections had given us all a much longer lifespan than even Dr. Schultz had anticipated. You can see why this would have been a dreadful thing for Jonathan to have to tell you. You never had the injections. That meant that while he stayed young, you would grow older and finally die. He loved you, and he could hardly stand that thought. Yet, if it was distressing to him, he thought how much more painful it would be to you. That is what he could not bring himself to tell you. He would have told you eventually. I know he intended to. Indeed, you would have found it out for yourself. You would have seen it happening. But it was hard. He kept putting it off, and then, finally, it was too late. Poor Jonathan, said Mrs. Frisby. He should have told me. I wouldn't have minded. But will my children also have longer lives? Said Nicodemus. We don't know yet. We think so, but our own children are not yet old enough to be certain. We do know they have inherited the ability to learn. They master reading almost without effort. He stood up, took out his reading glasses, and looked at the clock, but Mrs. Frisby interrupted again. One more thing, she said. What happened to Jenner? Nicodemus said. He left. He was against the plan from the start. In our discussions, he tried to persuade others to oppose it too. Only a few joined him, though there are some others who are still doubtful about it. They're going to stay with us and try it. The argument stayed reasonably friendly, but the last straw for Jenner was when we decided to destroy the machines. Destroy them? For two reasons. One, so that if anyone ever finds the cave, there won't be any evidence of what we've been doing. Nothing but broken bits of metal, debris that will look like ordinary junk. We'll pull out our electric cable, our lights, and our water pipes. We'll close up all the tunnels leading in. The other reason is more important. When we move to Thorn Valley, we're going to have some hard times. We know that, and we're braced for it. If this cave is still open, with the machines and lights, the carpets and running water still here, there will be a terrible temptation to give up and move back to the soft life. We want to remove that temptation. But when Jenner heard that decision, it was made at a meeting. He grew really angry. He denounced us all as idiots and dreamers. He stamped out of the meeting, and a few days later he left the group forever, taking 6 of his followers with him. We don't know where they went, but we think they will try to find somewhere where they can set up a new life like this one. I wish them luck, but they'll have trouble. There won't be any toy tinker this time. They'll have to steal their machines, everything. That worries us some, because if they get caught, who knows what might happen. But there's nothing we can do about it. We're going ahead with the plan, and once we get to Thorn Valley, I think we can stop worrying. Justin stood up. It's time to go. He picked up the paper with the sleeping draught in it. Mrs. Frisby, Justin, and Mr. Aegis walked together up the long corridor to the rosebush. Remember, when you come up through the hole in the kitchen floor, Mr. Aegis said, you'll be under a cabinet. It's low, and there's room to move. Go a few steps forward, and you'll be able to see out into the room. Mrs. Fitzgibbon will be there, getting dinner for her family. They eat at about 6. When she's got their dinner ready, she'll feed Dragon. He won't be in the kitchen, but he will be waiting just outside the kitchen door on the porch. She doesn't let him in while she's cooking, because he makes such a pest of himself, rubbing against her ankles and getting between her feet. If you look to your right, you'll see his bowl. It's blue, and it has the word kitty written over and over again around the side. She'll pick it up, fill it with cat food, and put it down again in the same place. Then watch closely. She'll walk over to the door to let him in, and that's your chance. Her back will be towards you. She's got to walk about 20 feet. It's a big kitchen. The bowl will be about 2 feet away from you. Be sure the paper packet is open. Then dash out, dump the powder into the food, and dash back. You don't want to be in sight when Dragon comes in. I can tell you that from experience. Is that how you got hurt? I got there a few seconds late. I decided there was still time. I was wrong. At the arch in the rosebush, Mr. Ages left them. With his cast, he would not be able to climb through the hole to the kitchen. There was no point in his going farther. Mrs. Frisby and Justin moved out of the rosebush and looked around them. It was still light, though the sun was low on the horizon. Oh, gotta do the light dance. Straight ahead of them, perhaps 200 feet away, stood the big white farmhouse. Dragon was already on the porch, sitting just outside the door, looking at it expectantly. To their right was the tractor shed, and beyond that was the barnyard fence and the barn itself, casting a long shadow. Behind them rose the woods and the mountains. To the left, Mrs. Frisby could see the big stone in the middle of the garden, near which her children waited. As soon as her task was done, she thought, she must hurry to them and get ready for the move. "We go under the right side of the house," Justin said, quietly. "Follow me." They made their way around the edge of the yard, staying in the shadows, keeping an eye on Dragon. Justin still wore his satchel and had put the powder package in it. There was a basement under the main part of the Fitzgibbons' house, but the big kitchen had been added later and stood on a foundation of concrete blocks, with only a crawl space beneath. As they approached this gray foundation, Mrs. Frisby saw that near the middle of it, a few inches off the ground, there was a square patch of darker gray. It was a hole, left for ventilation, and there was a screen over it. When they reached it, Justin caught hold of the screen and pulled the corner. It swung open. "We loosened it a bit," he explained, holding it open for her. Mrs. Frisby crept through. "Careful," he said. "It's dark. There's a drop-off of about a foot. Just jump. We put some straw at the bottom so it's soft." Holding her breath, Mrs. Frisby jumped blindly into the blackness and felt the cushion of straw under her feet. In a moment, Justin landed beside her. They were under the Fitzgibbons' kitchen. "Now," he said softly, "look to your left. See the patch of light? That's the hole. The light comes in from the kitchen. We've piled dirt up under it so it's easy to reach. Come on." Mrs. Frisby followed him. As they got near the bright hole, she could see around her a little. They were walking across bare earth, dry and cool to the touch. Overhead there were heavy wooden beams holding up the floor, and above those the floorboards themselves. Under the hole rose a small round hill of dirt. They walked up this, and then Justin whispered, "This is as far as I can go. There's not room for me to get through. I'll wait here. Come back down as soon as you're finished. Here's the powder." He handed her the paper packet. "Remember to tear it open before you go out to Dragon's bowl. Hurry, now. I can hear Mrs. Fitzgibbon moving around. She's getting the dinner. Be careful, and good luck." Mrs. Frisby first pushed the packet up through the hole. Then, as quietly as she could, grasping both sides, she pulled herself up and into the kitchen. It was light there, but Mr. Ages had not been joking when he said the ceiling was low. There was less than an inch between the floor and the bottom of the cabinet, so that she could not walk properly, but had to flatten herself out and crawl. She did a few steps and discovered that she was trembling. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Don't get panicky, or you'll do something foolish and spoil everything." Thus admonished, she crept forward again until she was near the edge of the cabinet. She stopped. From there she could see out into the kitchen fairly well. Straight across from her stood a big white gas stove, and in front of it, putting the lid on a pot, was Mrs. Fitzgibbon. Because the edge of the cabinet was so low, Mrs. Frisby could not see her head, but only up to her shoulders. "There," Mrs. Fitzgibbon said to herself. "The stew is done, the bread's in the oven, the table is set." Where was the cat's bowl? Mrs. Frisby looked to her right as Mr. Aegis had said. There it was, blue with words inscribed around the side. Yet something was wrong. It was not 2 feet from the cabinet, but more like 4 or 5. In the corner, where it should have been, rose 4 round wooden legs. She realized that she was looking at the bottom of a kitchen stool. No matter, she thought. The extra distance is just a couple of feet. Mr. Aegis had not mentioned a stool, but perhaps they moved it around. She crawled to her right as close to the bowl as she could get without showing herself, and tore open the package. Just as she did this, Mrs. Fitzgibbon walked over to the stove. Her hand appeared, picked up the bowl, and Mrs. Frisby heard it thump on the counter over her head. A cutting sound, a can opener, the scrape of a spoon, and the bowl was back on the floor. All right. I want you to think to yourself a prediction. What do you think is going to happen? Will she be successful? We'll find out. The strong, fishy smell of cat food. Mrs. Fitzgibbon walked away. Now, Mrs. Frisby moved swiftly out into the room, across the open floor, holding the powder, her eyes intent only on the bowl. She was no longer trembling. She poured in the powder, which instantly dissolved in the moist cat food. Still clutching the paper, she turned and sped toward the cabinet. With a bang, the lights went dim. The ceiling, which had somehow become curved, was filled with little round moons. Mrs. Frisby kept running, and her face struck a cold, hard wall of metal. A voice shouted, "Mother, don't let Dragon in yet. I've caught a mouse." Billy, the younger Fitzgibbon's son, had been sitting on the kitchen stool, his feet up on the rung, eating berries from a colander. The colander, upside down, was now over Mrs. Frisby. And we will stop there. All right. I'll see you tomorrow.